welcome to today's webinar. My name is Hadassah Bournes. I'm a Project Execution Officer at the BCRC-Caribbean, and I will be the moderator for today's session. So I just invite us to give about 1 more minute before we get straight into today's proceedings, and we look forward to also hearing your inputs throughout, so we will take it from there. Thank you. We did have quite a bit of registered participants, so I believe that we can officially get started and the others shall join as we proceed. So once again, welcome to today's Island Webinar Plus Forum, which we will be looking at the assessment to action on driving chemicals and waste policy with Islands Caribbean. Today's webinar really would provide us an opportunity to share key outcomes, practical tools, and lessons learned, as well as policy approaches developed throughout this project output. So we are very keen to share some of the things that came out of this consultancy under this project, as well as lessons learned from our consultants and some of our country participants, as well as taking the opportunity to share or hear from you all any questions that you all may have. So before we get into today's proceedings, we do have a few housekeeping rules. So I'll ask, thank you. So just some key things to note before we get started. Please keep your microphones muted when you are not speaking, just to help reduce any background noise or issues incoming. For any questions and comments, we really encourage you to use the Q&A box function down at the bottom. We will invite you to speak when appropriate, but if you have any questions throughout the presentation, we do encourage you to use that part to pose your questions, and any of our moderators or persons on the background will assist in bringing or flagging that question to the relevant speaker. We also ask you to place any questions or reflections in the chat box at any time. Again, the host or panelists, we will moderate that for you all. And we kindly ask that you please introduce yourself by name and organization and interest in the chat. So our host and panelists will note your participation in this webinar. We also kindly ask that you keep the questions and comments clear and concise, as we can give others a chance to contribute as well. We do have an allotted 90 minutes, so we do want to be efficient with that time as well. And we would like to note for you all that this session, there is translation available. It is in English, but we do have translation in Spanish and Portuguese. So we invite you to click on the globe at the bottom, which has interpretation, and select your language of choice. Also, please note that this session is being recorded for note-taking and reporting purposes. And finally, we encourage everyone to participate respectfully and constructively, as the aim is to create a useful and open space for learning and discussion. So with that, we can get straight into today's proceedings. So on the agenda for our allotted 90 minutes, we do have 2 sessions. The first session will take us through just our general introduction into the Islands Forum and a general overview of the output on the legislative and model policy. Then we will go to part 2 of our agenda in the 90 minutes that will look at the country contributions, as well as to hear from our consultants who supported the activity. And we will then allow for room for questions and answers. We'll do have a discussion segment there. So I really encourage you to explore that option. And then we shall close with our closing and next steps. So without further ado, I would like to go straight into our first agenda topic, which we will be looking at the welcome and introduction to the Islands Forum Plus, and I will pass to Jana. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Hadassah. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jana Thuaud, and I will introduce Islands to everybody. Next slide, please. So as we know, Islands is a Jeff Islands program, stands for Implementing Sustainable Low and Non-Chemical Development in Small Island Developing States. And today is a very important segment of discussion because we are facilitating opportunities for information exchange and knowledge sharing about our SIDS Chemicals and Waste Management Program. So part of our group, actually, we are a program funded by Jeff and involves 33 small island developing states across the Atlantic, Caribbean, Indian Ocean, and Pacific regions. We are led and implemented by UNEP, but also implemented by the FAO, IDB, and UNDP. And we are working with different executing agencies, including our co-host today, BCRC-Caribbean. Next slide, please. In Islands, we believe that participatory information exchange and opportunities for knowledge sharing is holistic and complete. So we have developed a digital knowledge ecosystem sharing that will combine webinars, online digital platforms like communities of practice, internal thematic exchanges, and in-person live events, including our Islands Knowledge Hub, to share information and enhance SIDS learning across the globe. We are now currently in our second theme for the series. We're exploring different themes and topics in regional deep dives, and this is why we have the Caribbean region. And without further ado, I think I will give back to Hadassah to introduce the Caribbean's work for islands. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jana, for that overview of the Islands program. So now I'll pass the floor to Ms. Amara Prevatt to take us through the overview of the work that as the executing agency in the Caribbean region, BCRC, especially under Output 1.1, what this activity and output entails. So over to you, Amara.
Hi, thank you very much, Hadassah. So we can go to the next slide. Good morning, good evening, everyone. So as mentioned, my name is Amara, and I'll be taking us through the overview of Output 1.1 under the Jeff 10279 and 10472 projects. We wanted just to first start off by just introducing who we are as the BCRC-Caribbean. So at this time, our full name is the Basel and Stockholm Conventions Regional Center for Training and Technology Transfer for the Caribbean. As a Basel Regional Center, Basel Convention Regional Center, we were established in 1995 at the third Conference of the Parties to the Basel Convention. And then in 2023, at the Stockholm Convention, Conference of the Parties, a decision was put forward to actually have the center become a Stockholm Convention regional center. That decision was endorsed and then adopted at that COP. The purpose of the center is to support contracting Caribbean parties with fulfilling their international obligations under the Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm, and Minamata conventions. And this is all being done to ensure that the parties are able to sustainably manage chemicals and waste in order to protect human health as well as the environment. So the center provides support to the region through by providing technical assistance. We complete training and capacity building. We also support raising awareness around different chemicals and waste management topics, as well as environmental topics and concerns. We engage with stakeholders across the region, and we also develop and execute both national and regional chemicals and waste management projects. If I could have the next slide, please. So as mentioned just now, one of the roles of the center is to help support the Caribbean with the development and then execution of regional projects that look at chemical and waste management. So at this time, we are currently executing 3 child projects under the Jeff Islands program. And across those 3 projects, we are working with a total of 12 Caribbean countries. So those range from countries as far west as Belize, as far south as Suriname in South America, and as far north as the Bahamas. Next slide, please. So today's webinar is going to focus on 2 of the 3 projects that the BCRC-Caribbean is executing under the Islands programs. So those are the Jeff 10279 project, which works with 9 Caribbean countries, and then the 10472 project, which works with 3 Caribbean countries. One of the things that I'd like just to flag is that both of the projects are being implemented by the UNEP. However, with the 10279 project, that project is also being implemented by the FAO. One of the things that was found as we started the execution of the project is that many of the outputs and activities across both of the projects are quite similar. So it was decided, as well as endorsed by the project steering committees of both projects, that these projects should be executed in a synergistic manner. So this was done in order to avoid duplication of efforts within the region, as well as to support these efficient and effective use of project funds. So under both of the projects, the components remain the same or are the same. And as I mentioned, a lot of the activities and outputs are also the same. So today's webinar will focus on component 1, which looks at preventing the future buildup of chemicals entering small island developing states. And under this component, one of our key outputs was output 1.1, which looked to strengthen the legal and institutional capacity and frameworks of the region. If I could have the next slide, please. All right. So with output 1.1, our objective was to assess and adapt the legislative and institutional frameworks of the 12 project countries to support the environmentally sound management of hazardous waste at both national and regional levels. Under the outputs, we had a total of 3 activities, the first of which looked to assess relevant legislation, infrastructure, as well as institutional capacities of the countries to manage hazardous waste and manage hazardous chemicals. The second activity looked at developing specific chemicals and waste policies and legislations to support the management of these products and materials. And then the third activity looked at developing national strategies to support the project countries with actually adopting and implementing the model policies and legislations that were developed under activity 2. If we could go to the next slide, please. Right. So now we'll take a look at the activity or the outputs and its execution. So this was one of the first outputs and activities that the center was able to kick off under the Islands projects in the region. So through our evaluation process, we awarded this consultancy to Ms. Fiona Pompey-Handel and her team. We got started back in 2023 and we were able to complete all of the outputs and its activities in November of last year. On this slide, we just take you through the different phases of the consultancy with Fiona and her team. So again, we would have started back in April of 2023 with the inception. We would have then moved to the assessment phase where the team would have taken a deep dive into the legislation that exists in each of the project countries, as well as what exists to support the management of chemicals and waste. They would have developed national assessment reports for each of the project countries. Then in November, we would have hosted the regional assessment validation workshop where the team would have presented their findings and the project countries would have supported with the validation of their work. The team would have then moved on to developing the regional model policy and the model legislation, which would have then been presented to the countries in July of 2024. And from there, the team would have then begun to work with each of the project countries to develop the national strategy and roadmaps to support each project country with the adoption and implementation of the regional model policy and the model legislations. Through the rest of 2024 and 2025, we would have worked with Fiona and her team to finalize the deliverables, to meet with the project countries to ensure that the national strategies and roadmaps were acceptable and of use to them. And then we would have worked to close out this consultancy and activity towards the end of last year. If I could have the next slide, please. Right. And then this is just to show you guys what this output looks like through pictures. So one of the first picture up top would be the inception meeting back in April of 2023. Then we would have had the regional assessment validation workshop in November of 2023. So that was hosted in Trinidad and Tobago and saw the participation of all 12 project countries. We would have then had the regional validation workshop in Barbados, and this was held in July of 2024, where the team would have presented the regional model policy and the model legislations. And after that, the team would have worked with each project country to develop and flesh out the national strategies and roadmaps. So we would have had individual workshops in each of the project countries to support that. And that is it for my presentation. So I'll pass the floor back to Hadassah. Thank you.
Thank you, Amara, for providing that overview and context on the Caribbean's execution of the Jeff Island project, especially the deliverables and the timeline flow of what it took to execute Output 1.1. So with that, I would now like to pass the floor to Ms. Britney Nurse, who was part of the consultancy team, where she will take us through the key outcomes and lessons learned that came out of the activities that were executed. So with that, I will pass the floor over to you, Britney. Thank you.
Thank you, Hadassah, and good morning or good afternoon to all of you, wherever you may be joining from. I would like to thank the organizers, BCRC-Caribbean, for extending the invitation to the consulting team to share our insights on a very important project for the Caribbean region. My name is Britney Nurse, and as Hadassah mentioned, I was one of the legal experts on the Legislative Institutional Framework Consulting team that was recruited by the BCRC-Caribbean to work on the activities under Output 1.1, as Amara would have gone over, for the Jeff Islands Caribbean Child Projects. Next slide, please. So the consulting team would have comprised of experts from legal, policy, and institutional and social sciences disciplines. We had the team lead, Ms. Fiona Pompey, handle, and she would have done the assessments for the Bahamas, Dominica, Guyana, and St. Kitts and Nevis. We also had with us Nancy Del Prado, who looked at St. Lucia and Suriname, Ms. Annika Fritz-Brown, who undertook the assessment for Antigua and Barbuda, Rosanna John, who looked at Belize, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic, and myself with my assigned countries, Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados. We would have also had an institutional expert who had a background in environmental policy, Dr. Therese Yard. And then, of course, we had our social sciences expert, Ms. Lisa Perch, through her local company, Sadie Consulting Barbados. And then, of course, we would have had some assistance from our project manager, Mr. Marlon Velosa, and last but not least, the legislative drafting expert, Ms. Christine Toppin-Alaha. Next slide, please. So over the course of my presentation, I will discuss the purpose of the consultancy, and I will focus on the key deliverables that the consulting team would have produced in alignment with our terms of reference and the overall project consultancy requirements. And the overall objective of this consultancy was to assess and adapt the legislative and institutional frameworks in the 12 Caribbean countries that I mentioned before to support the environmentally sound management of hazardous waste at both the national and regional levels. So to achieve that objective, the consulting team was required to achieve the 3 activities as you see here on the screen. The first being to assess relevant legislation, infrastructure, and institutional capacities to manage hazardous chemicals in materials, products, and waste at national and regional levels. We also had to develop specific hazardous chemicals and waste policies and legislation to support environmentally sound management at the national and regional levels. And then lastly, to develop national strategies and roadmaps with actions, lead entities, timelines, and outputs for the implementation and adoption of the model policy and legislation. So as you can see, given the broad scope of the activities, which were envisaged to cover 12 project countries, the consulting team would have also had to examine a variety of legal systems, the common law, civil law, and mixed traditions like the Roman Dutch, for example, in their assessments. And the assessment were not only limited to hazardous chemicals and waste in general, but we also looked specifically to 4 waste streams, such as the electrical and electronic equipment and its waste, end-of-life vehicles, plastics, as well as the mercury-added products and their waste. Next slide, please. So I will now move on to the first key deliverable that the consulting team produced during this consultancy, that being the National Legislative and Institutional Capacity Reports. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, the complement of the team was such given the broad scope of the assessment. So each of the experts, the legal experts, were assigned 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 countries to conduct detailed assessments of the existing policies, the legislation, and the institutional capacities in each of the countries, with a view to determining the country's status in managing hazardous chemicals and waste, inclusive of the 4 specific waste streams that I would have mentioned earlier. The environmental and policy management expert that we had on our team, Dr. Yard, would have assessed the existing regional or sub-regional mechanisms that were in place to manage these waste streams, and would have also assessed the institutional capacities in each country to support the implementation of a regional model policy at the national and regional level, which I'll get into later in my presentation. Additionally, as I mentioned, we had the social sciences expert through her company who would have conducted the assessment of the social and economic implications, both positive and negative, of course, on gender and vulnerable populations. So that would have included the indigenous populations, women, children, differently able, and other vulnerable groups. And that assessment would have, of course, been based on the existing legislation and the infrastructural capacities for managing the hazardous chemicals and waste in the respective countries. So on this slide, what you will see is an outline of what each report would have contained for the countries. There was the inventory of the national policy instruments, the status of the country under the BRS and M conventions, also the status under existing regional or sub-regional harmonization arrangements. Then, of course, the legal experts would have done their analysis of the legislation governing the waste streams of concern. The institutional expert did her institutional mapping, which would have identified some of the competent regulatory public bodies, as well as some identification of relevant private sector and civil society organizations, and of course their roles and functions and where those overlap. And we would have also had the analysis of the socioeconomic and gender implications for the vulnerable groups. And lastly, the identification of gaps, barriers, needs, and the consulting team would have put forward their recommendations as well. Now, in some of the country reports, there would have been an annex which included questionnaires completed by the national working group for each project country. And this was really a mechanism that was developed in each country where key stakeholders and experts in the field of chemicals and waste management were designated to provide oversight on the project activities. And this was one method, the questionnaire, of data collection utilized by some of the countries. In other countries, there would have been national consultations that would have been held with the legal experts from the consulting team to, of course, provide the information needed to complete the assessment. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this next slide looks at the methodology, the assessment tools, and the capacity evaluation. Through the undertaking of this activity, which is the National and Institutional Capacity Assessment, the consulting team conducted their assessment through desktop review of the national legislation, policy, and institutional arrangements in each project country. And as I mentioned before, the data collection would have varied through the use of a questionnaire or through consultations held with the national working groups. The assessment would have also built upon previous assessments that were conducted under other GEF and UN projects, such as the POPs project. And we would have also taken into consideration the findings from the Minamata initial assessments in the Caribbean. And once those assessments were completed for all 12 countries, we then would have had a regional validation workshop, which was facilitated by the BCRC-Caribbean, to allow the consulting team to present the initial findings on the detailed assessments. And that presentation would have taken place in front of the national working groups as well as other key stakeholders that were invited from the project countries. So that would have happened around November 2023 and took place in Trinidad and Tobago. And then just for reiteration purposes, these were some of the areas that we evaluated as part of the capacity assessment. So we looked at the existing policy instruments, looking at the treaty status of each project country under the BRS&M conventions, looking at the national laws that were governing the chemicals and waste streams of concerns, looking at the institutions, and then the socioeconomic and gender implications. So I will just pause here and hand over to Hadassah.
Thank you, Brittany, for taking us through the first segment looking at deliverable one with the national and institutional capacity reports, highlighting specifically noting like the different expertise of the consulting team that was put together to really capture these reports, and noting the different ways of data collections to either fill the gaps or build the capacity, building off of what was done in the region. As you said, not to duplicate the efforts of what was already done in country and just to build off of it. Especially working within the region with 12 countries, we do know that consultants have to pivot a bit to get information from each of the countries. It may not be the same. So we do commend the efforts that were put in to ensure that the assessment was done in a holistic manner and trying to get as much information as possible. I do note my colleagues had put in the chat information on the availability of these assessments report that will be made available on the Islands Learn platform in August. So I do encourage you all to look out for that and access and take a look through the reports when they're made available. They have also provided additional resources and links. So I would encourage you all to go through those links at your convenience just to build on the information that is already existing out there. So before we move into the next session, I will just ask, and I can ask my colleagues to facilitate this as well, if there are any questions from the audience thus far before we move into the next section.
All good, Hadassah, from the Q&A. You can move on.
Okay. All right, so since we don't have any questions before we move right into the next section, I do have a question for you, Brittany. So what is the key findings or results from these assessments and evaluations that would help develop model policies and legislations?
Okay, so in relation to the findings from the assessments, as I mentioned before, the scope of the project was across 12 countries. So it wasn't like we did a regional assessment, we had individual national assessments. And so the findings from each would have varied from country to country. However, one of the common themes that we would have found through the assessment, and of course, when the consulting team would have come together through our usual internal meetings, is that the countries have laws. There are legal frameworks that are actually present in the region. But the issue was really how it was administered, how it was governed. And what I mean by that is that the hazardous chemicals and waste that were governed by a variety of administrations. So we had some environmental management agencies that were handling some aspects of hazardous chemicals and waste. Other countries would have been solid waste management authorities, and then others would have been public health agencies. On the 4 priority waste streams in particular, the end-of-life vehicles, mercury-added products, the plastics, and which one did I leave out? The plastics. Yeah, I think I covered all of them. Some of the countries had some regulations with the disposal of derelict vehicles. Others had some restrictions on single-use plastics. But across the board, we didn't really find an extended producer responsibility mechanism in place in the legislation across the life cycles of each of the waste of concern. We had, of course, countries that were on different stages in terms of where they're at in terms of their legislation. So the Dominican Republic, for example, they had quite a robust e-waste legislative framework that included that extended producer responsibility. But again, like the topics in general, it didn't necessarily sit under one parent act in a single country. They were kind of scattered and stuff as well. So based off of that, when we go into the regional model policy and the model legislation, we had to now sort of figure out how do we want to really shape this. The assessment really would have told us, okay, it may be easier for us to do a regional model to help the countries and more particularly to help them with these particular legal modules. And by that, I mean these specific waste streams to draft based on those waste streams. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. So I will encourage, based on what Brittany indicated there with the key findings, it may be similar to your regions, wherever you are from the audience as well. So with that, if we can segue into the next section, which looks at the regional model policy and model legislation. So back over to you, Brittany.
Great, thank you. Can I have the next slide? Yes. So this here is just an overview of the 2 deliverables, the regional model policy and the model legislation, just side by side. As I mentioned before, the consulting team under the second activity was required to draft a regional model policy to promote the harmonization of cross-cutting efforts across the region. And in doing so, Dr. Therese Yard, as well as our team lead, Mrs. Pompey Handel, had to consider the obligations of all 12 countries under relevant international conventions, especially as they related to the 4 specific waste streams. And so the regional model policy was drafted to inform and provide a foundation for the regional model legislation. On the model legislation, deliverables specifically, the legislative drafter on our team is Christine Topin-Alaha, who actually had prepared the Regional Integrated Chemicals Management Act under the POPs project. For those of you that would have been involved in that project, she would have been responsible for preparing a suite of the laws, as you see here, tailored to the 4 specific waste streams, which were drafted to be adapted to each country regardless of their legal system. So moving on to the next slide, please. Right. So as I mentioned before, the regional model policy was drafted by Dr. Yard and Mrs. Pompey Handel, and its purpose was to give the project countries an indication of the goals and the aims that the countries can include and consider in the formulation of their own national policies. And so when we had the regional validation workshop in Trinidad and Tobago in November of 2023, the stakeholders that were present would have indicated that the model policy that we envision to develop should be grounded in the global framework on chemicals for a planet free of harm from chemicals and waste. And that particular framework was adopted at the 5th International Conference on Chemicals Management in 2023, which was a voluntary global framework succeeding the strategic approach to international chemicals management. The policy as well was also informed by the Bonn Declaration, which was a high-level political declaration adopted at that same conference. And so when we look at the structure now of the regional model policy, it set out 10 policy goals with each corresponding aims, or otherwise referred to as objectives. And the goals itself were designed to correspond with the commitments in paragraph 18 of the Bonn Declaration, and the policy aims in particular were to align with the targets that were set out in Section 5 of the Global Framework on Chemicals. And so the significance of this anchoring is pretty much as a regional translation of the agreement that was endorsed at the global conference itself. The experts in preparing this regional model policy encouraged that the countries convene their own national consultations and validation exercises before incorporating any element of the model into their national frameworks. And it was also recommended that there be close collaboration with the private sector and with non-governmental organizations in both the customization and the implementation of the regional model policy. I'd also like to note that this regional model policy was in fact presented to the national working groups and other relevant stakeholders at the regional workshop in Barbados in July of 2024, which allowed the opportunity for those stakeholders to provide feedback and approve of the content of the regional model policy. Moving now to the model legislation. The next slide, please. Sorry. Right. So the decision of the consulting team's legislative experts to take a modular approach to this particular deliverable came as a result of the assessment findings. As I mentioned before, hazardous chemicals and waste management is governed by existing laws in every country, but is administered across different agencies and authorities. So on the 4 waste streams that the consultancy focused on, as you're seeing on the screen, the picture across the region was fragmented. We had some countries that had the legislation to dispose of derelict vehicles. And that needs to be differentiated between the end-of-life vehicles. We also had several countries that adopted measures to ban or control specific plastic products, but they did not necessarily have a piece of legislation that was already enacted to fully govern all aspects of plastic pollution. And then, as I mentioned before, we did not find any of the countries that had the extended producer responsibility on the vehicles, for example, across their life cycles, or for the vehicles specifically. So given that legal and institutional landscape, the consultant had decided that it would have been better to do a one-size-fits-all omnibus model that could be useful for the countries. And so what we had drafted was 4 separate legal modules. Each model was drafted with the intent to be incorporated into a project country's existing waste management legal framework, which could have been done by amendment or as a standalone parent act, or through being introduced as a regulation to a parent act that is already in place. As I mentioned again, the regional validation workshop in Barbados, this same document with, well, these 4 pieces of legislation were presented to the National Working Groups for validation, and we would have also had representatives from CARICOM to look at these products, and give their feedback, particularly for regional endorsement. So that concludes segment 2 of my presentation. Hadassah, are there any questions thus far?
Thank you, Brittany, for that. Just looking at the chat here, I don't believe we have any questions just yet. And also looking at the time, because I know we have another additional segment there. I believe you covered it well. I was going to ask, like, how can these model policies support to accelerate implementation of national strategies of chemicals and waste management? But we do have a section carded to hear from 2 of our participating countries. So I think that we can move into the next segment and then we can open the floor there for that.
No problem.
So,
and possibly in my presentation of these strategies, that will become a bit more clear as I go along.
Yeah.
Right, but I'm open to any questions that come. So the last deliverable, as I mentioned, focus on the development of national strategies and roadmaps per country for the adoption and implementation of the regional model policy and model legislation. So there was a lot of ground that this consulting team undertook in this particular project. Again, this would have been 12 national strategies and roadmaps that were developed with the assistance of the legal experts in collaboration with the national working groups and other actors that we would have interfaced in this phase of the project. So the national strategy drew on the outputs of the previous activities, the assessment and the regional model policy and the model legislation, in order to improve the national chemicals and waste management framework, which facilitated the success of the proposed interventions by the project. And so what this national strategy really did is it documented the roles and responsibilities, the description of tasks, the supporting agencies, outputs, and timelines. So what you're seeing on the screen here is just a list of the purpose and the function of these documents. As I said, we use the assessment findings as a preliminary baseline, even though the countries will have to do their further baseline assessments just to buff up from any changes in circumstances that would have occurred since we had done this project, to identify the areas, the priority areas that were relevant to chemicals and waste management. It would, of course, given directions to the implementers of the strategy on the steps to follow, and it would have indicated what must happen, who does the particular actions, by what timeline, and what the result would be. And then, of course, in some of the strategies that were drafted and as I mentioned, because we had that interface with the different actors and relevant sectors of chemicals and waste, we also included a basis for review and evaluation, so a monitoring and evaluation framework for the adoption and the implementation of the regional model policy and model legislation. Next slide, please. So in terms of the development phase of the national strategies, the consulting team utilized the assessment findings, having considered the gaps, barriers, needs, and the recommendations that were put forward to formulate the strategies. And in so doing, we developed these strategies and roadmaps and convened national working sessions with various sectors, to assess the financial, the material, and the human resources that would have been needed to implement these recommendations and the model policy and legislation. The documents were then presented at a national workshop in each project countries with the NWGs and stakeholders involved in the life cycle management of the chemicals and waste, and feedback was gathered to finalize the strategies and the roadmaps. So essentially, each national strategy in substance is an action plan on a timeline that the country sets for itself. And that, of course, would be tied to its international obligations and to its own national development priorities. And what it would have done is identify the priority areas relevant to hazardous chemicals and waste, the actions required, and the institutional assignments. And in drafting this national strategy, the legal experts had decided deliberately to design them to be adaptive so that it can absorb any new challenges and any new opportunities that may arise in the respective country, and of course written to complement and align with the existing frameworks, and overall to offer some guidance where those frameworks would have fallen short. Next slide, please. So these are some of the key elements of the implementation roadmaps that went with these strategies. The roadmap was designed to guide the timely implementation of the national strategy, and it was presented in the form of a table. It would have set out the key actions required, the designated lead entity, the supporting entities, those that would assist, of course, the time frame, and then of course the expected outputs. So for any given objective in a national strategy, say for example strengthening national legislative frameworks, a country would be able to see on the implementation roadmap table what has to happen in order to achieve that objective, who has to take charge or own the action, who would support it, and of course the time frame. Now, in this particular project, the stakeholders, of course, would have given the experts a time frame of 15 years. So when you see references to short, medium, or long term, it was that 15-year time frame was actually broken up. So like 1 to 5 years would have been the short term, then the 6 to 10th year would have been medium, and then 10 beyond would have been long term. But of course, at the national level, the countries would be free to adapt that time frame accordingly, as some countries may have actually preferred to keep it within a political 5-year period. Next slide, please. So with all projects and with all work that has to be done, there will always be challenges that one would encounter. And in this slide, what we have done is just neatly summarize what were just a few of the challenges that our team faced and the measures that we used to mitigate those challenges. And we also put forward some recommendations. So the first one was we had some staggered feedback from the stakeholders that came also in multiple versions of the same deliverable report. And so what we did to try to mitigate in terms of any delay is that we aim to release certain deliverables on time or even earlier than the expected deadline to receive feedback in a timely manner. And BCRC thankfully was also able to arrange or facilitate any meetings that the consulting team would have needed with the NWGs or any other stakeholders where necessary to get feedback. And so one of the recommendations that we would put forward is, of course, the use of one version of the document on a shared platform, whether it's OneDrive, Google Drive, whatever platform, to track the progress. So you'll be able to see when the work is being done, but also the comments from all relevant reviewers will just go into that one document. Another recommendation that we'll put forward for this is a common guide, being beneficial to the reviewers before they send in the feedback. So it's pretty much like the feedback is streamlined and easier for the consulting team to follow. And then another challenge was just the stakeholder engagement pretty much had varied across the project activities. So we had difference in like the breadth or even the depth of the technical comments that we received on some of the deliverables. But what we had done is really encourage, and again, through the help of BCRC, to encourage feedback on the earlier reports at all stages of the project, and new stakeholders were just asked to review reports as they come along. The recommendation for that, and of course it will show up in my next slide, which is the lessons learned, is really, which we could actually go into one time, please. Right, the integration of the expertise from inception. So what we found is that a lot of the stakeholders had really benefited from that integration of the legal, the technical, and even the social sciences perspectives. And one of the lessons that we learned from this is that from inception, we should try to integrate that expertise as early on, possibly also to get those technocrats that are versed in the conventions to be put forward with a legal expert and stuff as well, which we recognize through the meetings and stuff kind of helped to bolster the feedback that we needed in order to produce these reports. Another thing too that we learned is designing for adaptation. It wasn't possible to do national policies for each project country, so the regional models and even the legislation. So the regional models really provides that strong foundation that allows for the national stakeholders through their different legal systems to adapt and identify their priority areas to shape that implementation of the relevant policy and legislation. As I would have already mentioned, strengthening the feedback would be helpful, just in terms of having the comment guides and then the consistent project contacts and the post-workshop technical updates to improve the continuity. And I would, of course, like to thank BCRC particularly for the use of the national project assistance in each countries. That made a huge difference in getting us the information that we needed. And I think it helped in terms of being able to identify those key stakeholders from early on. So that would have been the last lesson in terms of the early mapping of the focal points, the technical officers, and the legal counterparts that had to be engaged to improve the data quality and the validation. And so that ends my presentation. I hope it was helpful, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Brittany, for that extensive and detailed presentation. I think it would have answered a few questions that we had posed, but what I'll do now, I'll take the opportunity just to read out a few of those questions and we will tackle them in the Q&A section. So the first one that we received, and I see all the thumbs up and reactions are coming in, so yes, well received. The first question we had was from Mr. Arnold Thuaud. This is the JEF coordinator and team lead for the chemicals and waste division in JEF. So Arnold was asking, what are the enforcement provisions of legislation once or if it is enacted, and why have separate laws for each waste stream rather than an overarching act with regulations? And I believe this is a pointed question that the countries can answer. So once we go into their presentation, I'll invite any of our countries to respond to this as well. We also had a question from Mr. Bash asking what were some of the challenges the team experienced while creating and implementing a project like this? Was it difficult to create an omnibus model that can be integrated into existing legislation for that particular amount of countries? And I think Brittany started touching on this challenge highlighted in the slides, but we can also open the opportunity to hear also from BCRC sides what were their take on this type of challenge that may have been faced throughout the execution of this activity. And we did have a last input in the chat from Ms. Zapata, looking at thanking Brittany for sharing the information and that they're currently working on designing a pilot on a regional level within the Caribbean, looking at the safe transboundary shipment of, I believe it's vehicle batteries from smaller countries, smaller island states to bigger island states, building off of previous project work that was done. So Ms. Zapata indicated that she has been in contact with the BCRC, so we could look at exploring a bit more there on what we can build off. As you said, we don't want to duplicate efforts of what has already been done in the Caribbean. So to explore ways that we can build off of the work that was already done. And as our colleagues from CCKM indicated in the chat, we do have the resources available as well, so you all can have access to read up on what was done and the outcomes.
Thank you, Hadassah. I think while we're getting her back, the reminders are there on the on the chat box. And thank you, Lovemore, for raising your hand. Kindly put your Q&A. And now,
Without further ado,
okay, Hadassah, are you back?
hi.
All right, we can hear you.
Oh, I am so sorry. I was passing the floor. Jana, you can just let me know what you're heard up to.
Okay, we
But,
just when you froze a little bit 2 minutes ago or 1 minute ago,
oh,
we just reminded everybody to post their questions on the Q&A box, and we will
okay.
hand over to you to introduce our next session, the part 2 of our webinar today.
Yes. So do apologize for that. I was talking ahead and not realizing that I was frozen. So as Jana indicated, we will now move into the session where we can hear from a few of our countries who participated in this activity. So I will first pass the floor to Mr. Aldo Cansino, an environmental officer from the Department of Environment of Belize. From Belize, and he will take us through his shared experience throughout this output. So without further ado, I'll pass to Aldo. Confirming that you all can hear me. And
good morning.
Over to you.
Thank you, Hadassah. Good morning, everybody. Good day, wherever you are. Thanks for the introduction. If you can go to the slide, please. So, environmental and sound management of chemicals. I'll start off with this. Hazardous chemicals and hazardous waste in SIDS, the Caribbean, and Belize. Not necessarily something that we think about and we associate with. So whenever you're thinking about islands, you're thinking about water, you're thinking about pristine nature, you're thinking about a lot of things. Hazardous chemicals isn't one of them. Hazardous waste isn't either, especially for small countries. So as Ms. Nurse had mentioned, the consultancy provided an overview of some of the challenges in each country. And in relation to hazardous chemicals, one of the key findings, which we already knew, was that chemicals management, and I'll switch from I won't refer it to as hazardous. I would just say chemicals management is disaggregated. There's no one entity that is responsible for everything. There's no any mechanism in place for coordination. So in Belize, we have the Pesticides Control Board, who are primarily responsible for the management of pesticides. Belize Agricultural Health Authority, they handle veterinary products and fertilizers. Ministry of Health and Wellness looks at pharmaceuticals, medicines. The police are currently responsible for dangerous goods. Customs and excise, they interface with all of these import and exports. In Belize, for example, we have a gap where industrial chemicals is not necessarily managed by anyone. And when you think about waste, we do have a solid waste management authority. The system that has been built since 2008 includes the construction of transfer stations across the country where municipal bodies take their waste, they offload, that is then transferred from that site to the central or the regional sanitary landfill, which manages primarily municipal waste. The site does have a hazardous waste cell for the disposal of certain types of hazardous waste. Separation at source is still not a reality in Belize. What highlights of one of the things that the report had highlighted was that a financing for waste management is done through an environmental tax. That was the initial intent. That doesn't necessarily equate to the same thing. That's what initially, when the tax was implemented, that's how they thought that it would have been administered. That's not the case. Municipalities, I think there's only one municipality that charges its residents for, well, actually, another municipality just started, charges a minimal fee to assist with garbage collection. There at the sites there are tipping fees. Not everybody pays tipping fees because of working arrangements with, for example, the town councils or the city councils. The city councils that vehicles that transport waste do not pay the tipping fee. So we need to look at cost recovery mechanisms. When you look at this disaggregation, you also have DOE who also provides support. And we do have legislation that looks at hazardous waste, management of medical waste. We have a legislation that deals with the phasing out of certain plastics. And the greatest opportunity, in my view, is since 2010, we have a Returnable Containers Act, which is a deposit return scheme on certain products. Next slide, please. So again, the report highlighted a lot of the things that are the realities on the ground, and really and truly the issue in relation to chemicals management. The PCB and BAHA and some of these organizations have existed before, are managing certain components or certain specific types of chemicals. And until about 2009, 10, 11, we started to really gain traction on looking at things from an integrated standpoint. So with the SciCam, we had, it was that project introduced integrated chemicals management principles, international planning. So the Horizon 2030 should have components that address or start to address issues related to chemicals management. SciCam 2, which was another project, provided a draft legislation for integrated chemicals management. So it's the ICM bill. It provided institutional assessment and a business plan. Jeff 5558, which was the POPs project that Miss Britney had mentioned, looked at, so our bill then was aligned with the regional bill that she spoke about. So it enhanced the pathway and took direction to align itself with some regional considerations. And Jeff Islands, for example, continues to support this. We just updated the legislation with the current, to align with current policies and direction. Because since the journey started, there have been several changes. But the good news is that we have already established an interim National Integrated Chemicals Management Committee which was established this year. This is actually taking now the recommendations that are in the bill and institutionalizing them. This NICM, Interim NICM Committee, serves as the coordinating entity to guide chemicals management in Belize. It includes government stakeholders, academia, private sector representatives, and what we're currently doing is we're starting a consultation phase where we will engage with different stakeholders to get support and to hear views on the draft bill. Later, well, next month in the 18, in the week of the 24th to the 29th, we have scheduled a meeting with the Solicitor General where we want to introduce what we're doing so that get that buy-in early so that when we move forward, we have her support and we can pass this through get the ICM bill from a bill to an act. And so looking at things, we are addressing some of the components through an integrated approach. Next slide, please. So benefits and uses of Output 1.1. So the roadmap provides for mechanisms that can be undertaken to strengthen the management of different waste streams, ELV, mercury, plastic. But for us, the most important thing is that we are doing this through the ICM. So we're looking at it from a holistic perspective rather than an individual chemical or individual waste perspective. However, when you look at all of these legislations that have been developed, there are some things that we want to see how we integrate and how we utilize. For example, with the plastic pollution, the draft regional framework looks at EPR, right? So currently, the DOE is reviewing the implementation of the plastic phase out that it started since 2020 and looking to see how we have been implementing. Has it been effective? Is it meeting its targets? And with this evaluation, we want to then look at some of the recommendations in some of the regulations in the draft to see if there's any applicability and how we can utilize that regional model or aspects of the regional model to improve our national context. In terms of the EPR, EPR is something that I think is something that we need to consider. The DOE had done an assessment previously of the deposit return scheme, the Returnable Containers Act, and one of the recommendations is how can we utilize principles of EPR in this. And so we're looking at the different components from the e-waste, from the mercury, from ELV and plastics, because each one of them has an EPR component to it. How can we integrate, or what can we learn from this, or what can we use this in either the RCA, in the plastics regulation, or can we just develop would it be better to look at EPR from a broader perspective, and then through the schedules, then the DOE can, or whichever authority can then look and see, okay, these are the resources that we can manage using EPR. In relation to the end-of-life vehicles, the DOE had a scrap metal regulation that was repealed. But one of the things with the ELV is that it does have a component that really is important. I think it has a deregistration, or has a when your vehicle is no longer useful and you're going for scrap, there should be a mechanism to deregister the vehicle, or to notify the transporter, notify someone that the vehicle is no longer running, right? So that give you an idea of how many derelict vehicles you have. So these are some of the benefits and some of the potential uses for us. Next slide, please. In terms of recommendation for improvement, one of the things, and I think one of the comments had mentioned it, is that someone in the had asked this question in the comments, and I think it's spot on, which is when we're looking at projects, we need to design projects with a bigger picture perspective rather than individual. So let's look at the picture holistically rather than small pieces of the puzzle. Because looking at consultancies and legislation from a single way stream doesn't always give you the result that you think you will get. Why? Because we're small. For us, it will be the same stakeholders, so there's stakeholder fatigue. And also, if we look at it from that particular lens, it doesn't become feasible for us to implement a legislation only on ELV, only on WEE, only on mercury added products. We need to look at waste management from the broad perspective. We already have the hazardous waste regulations. How can we use these principles into the hazardous waste regulations or the medical waste regulation or the Solid Waste Management Authority Act? And how can we look at it from that holistic perspective? And then from there, then make or have provisions that when it becomes a reality that we have the volumes or we can manage it in a certain way. But looking at it from a small lens isn't beneficial for us. So that's the other one. And lastly, and I think this is more towards again going to project design. These projects need to have an impact on the ground. The consultancies, the baselines, all of this is important because that's how you develop policy. But at the end of the day, if we have a project that has only consultancies, only reports, only drafts, then what really is the impact? And so moving forward, these are the things that we need to look at from a strategic view in terms of getting the impact on the ground. And it starts with project design. But the consultancies and the reports that are developed are very useful. And it is country dependent. The countries have to make use of it and place the value on each of these reports. And there are things that won't probably be applicable to every single country, but there are components of it that we can use, and we move with those things in mind. And with that, I will gladly answer any question that you may have, or probably after the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Aldo, for that insight on Belize's perspective of the activity and your recommendations on a country level. I am noting the time, so we will look to move straight into Ms. Jiselle Joseph's presentation from Trinidad and Tobago. So I'll pass the floor to Jiselle, and then we will take our questions and answers during the following session afterwards. So without further ado, I'll pass the floor to Ms. Jiselle Joseph. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hadassah. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, from wherever you're joining us. I'll be very quick in terms of going through some of the things that have been beneficial for us as part of this project and the outputs that would have been generated. So I would have focused on two areas because these, I think, are the two areas right now where we can get, as a country, meaningful progress being made in terms of the initiatives. In terms of the assessment that was done for Trinidad and Tobago, one of the key recommendations that were made was based on strengthening the legal framework for the management of hazardous chemicals. And they cited the things like strengthening the Basel Convention implementation, harmonization of the chemicals and waste legislation, update of the subsidiary legislation. So, I am actually very happy to report that we have things that are actually in progress and in train that is very much in alignment with the outputs of the consultancy. In terms of the chemicals and waste management, we would have developed a policy for the management of chemicals and pesticides for Trinidad and Tobago. And that policy for the management and control of the pesticides and toxic chemicals was actually developed heavily in consideration of outputs from the Jeff 5558 POPs project and that integrated chemicals management regional model, that the elements of that model, as well as the pesticides model law that was developed under the disposal of obsolete pesticides, including POPs project, that was also implemented and Trinidad was a part of. So we are very happy to state that, those aspects have been considered, and it is cited actually in the policy that was developed. That policy has been approved by Cabinet, and it is now before the Attorney General's office, where it would proceed to the updates of the existing Pesticides and Toxic Chemicals Act that would give effect to these updates. So we're very happy that we've actually made some significant progress in the area of chemicals management for Trinidad and Tobago with respect to this aspect. We have also been working on bringing legal force to the provisions of the Basel Convention, and we have drafted a technical policy and legislative brief as well as an accompanying draft bill that would actually finally bring that legal force. We were able to post that document for public comment locally, and we are currently in the phase of incorporating those comments into the document so that they can be submitted for final approval. So really happy to report the progress that is being made, and a lot of the things that are associated with these projects are very much in alignment with the recommendations that were made under the outputs of this particular component of the project. In terms of plan, our national environmental policy, which is a policy that governs environmental management across the country and involves various actors who would be involved in its implementation, is due for an update in 2028-2029. The current policy was last updated in 2018, and where we are looking at opportunities for improvement would have been one of the areas that would have been identified as an area lacking, which would have been in the area of gender and vulnerable groups. So, a lot of the recommendations that came out of the assessment report and in the strategy that speaks to those particular issues, we have the opportunity to capture them in the update of this particular policy when it comes on train in 2028 and 2029. As well, in terms of the subsidiary legislation, the waste management rules under the Environmental Management Act addresses the management of waste, both non-hazardous and hazardous waste in Trinidad and Tobago. And while it does reference the management of specific waste streams, including e-waste, we would want to look at some of the recommendations that came out of this report in how we can actually improve upon and update the existing regulations so that it will be more in line with the provisions that are included and our international obligations. So those are the two other areas that we can see. It is actually something that the EMA is looking at right now in terms of the review of its legislation, including the Act. So any opportunities that we have to improve on it, to include those aspects that have come out of the assessment, we are very much in a good position to adopt a lot of these measures. Next slide. So on the other area, one of the other areas, we would have had 7 priority areas identified in our strategic roadmap. And one of the other areas that we were looking at was in the area of education and public awareness, mainly because for us, particularly at the EME, it's more or less a low-hanging fruit. It's things that we see the opportunity for actually incorporating into our programs. So the priority area was looking at developing communication plans adapted for specific target groups, example, households, schools, the informal sector, etc. And the EMA typically develops a corporate communication plan as well as its public education and awareness plans that will seek to target specific areas, specific groups. And we typically, coming out of these projects, take the opportunity to pass that information on, develop tools and other mechanisms that we can use to build capacity. And this is another opportunity here. We certainly will be looking at some of the areas that were highlighted for the 4 waste streams, so the mercury added products, the end-of-life vehicles, e-waste, all of which are very much prevalent and key priority areas for us in Trinidad and Tobago in terms of promoting and developing that awareness amongst the population. Because I noticed someone talking about an all of society approach in their comments in the chat, and I totally agree. We can do a lot of things on the legislative side, but we need to get buy-in across all areas or across all sectors, private, public, and legislative. So I think that this is something that we can actually capitalize on moving forward, and we will actively be looking at opportunities within our programs, particularly at the EMA, to actually, bring these things into being. We also do targeted consultations with various groups. It's part of the work that we do at the EMA, and we see the opportunity to use these targeted consultations to bring effect to that particular recommendation in the roadmap, which is to do those targeted consultations and educational sessions with stakeholders. Under the waste management rules, we tend to do these things on a regular basis, either individually or we target specific groups and sectors. And this is where we can, based on these emerging waste streams, do targeted sessions to ensure that all actors are brought up to speed, are very much aware of the risks, the issues, and the key requirements for managing these types of waste. So again, for us, we have identified this as a key area that we can actually get major traction on based on what we have available to us, and in moving forward, how we can, bring things to the fore in Trinidad and Tobago in implementing our roadmap. Next slide. And finally, in terms of recommendation, one of the main things I think that worked for us, and I guess would recommend to other countries in these types of projects, is really looking at and ensuring that these outputs align with country priorities and initiatives. It is so important. You won't be able to get a lot of things off the ground unless these things actually align with what your country has prioritized. And we have been very fortunate, particularly in the last year or so, seeing that appetite within the government for pursuing environmental projects and plans. So when you're actually part of the project, it's important to try and influence and try to get a lot of the outputs that come from these projects that can be beneficial, not just from the perspective of providing good information, but how can they be designed so that it is easily incorporated into existing systems. That is what was able to happen to us, and is why we're able to, look at the opportunities for bringing things into being based on the initiatives that had already been, in train for the country. So I would want to recommend that, we pay specific attention and influence as far as we can as countries participating in these projects, making sure that these outputs are clearly and efficiently aligned with what our country's objectives are. And we expect that will help to bring more success in moving the outputs to true outcomes, based on the implementation of the project. And with that, I will hand back over to Hadassah, and we'll entertain any questions in the open forum.
Thank you for that, Jiselle and Aldo, collectively, to give us the insights from both Belize and Trinidad and Tobago on your challenges, recommendations on how you all will implement this. Now, noting the time that this webinar is supposed to finish in just a few minutes, what we will do, we can provide an additional space for questions. I do believe some of the information that was presented answered some of the earlier questions. But just to take one more, we did have one coming in for you, Jiselle, asking regarding medical and healthcare waste managed in Trinidad and Tobago. Now that Trinidad and Tobago has ratified the Minamata Convention, how will mercury containing waste and products be managed?
Hi,
if any thought has been given to that as well.
Yes, thank you. We did have a project very recently. I think it was actually during the time of COVID, where we looked at, the management of medical waste. So there are already systems that have been, established, developed, designed. It's ready for implementation. And we can capitalize on what has been done under that project for actually, bringing those things into reality. So it's not that it's not in place. We actually did get a head start on that. And we were able to, develop some proposed measures, mechanisms that can be implemented for the management of that particular waste stream.
Okay. Thank you for that. So with that, I do not want to disregard again the questions that were posed by everyone else. An option that was put forward as well is to the CCKM team can organize a Q&A session with the speakers in the Green Forum platform at a later date in case you'll have any questions here. And I do invite our panelists as well to look through the chat while we move to close off on the next steps. Look at the chat and see any relevant questions if you all did not answer in your presentation that you all can respond to directly. So with that, I will now pass to Jana to take us through the closing, next steps and closing. So over to you, Jana.
Thank you, Hadassah. I think at this point, I'd like to invite our speakers to open their camera, and we'd really like to acknowledge Jiselle, Aldo, Britney, and Amara for representing the Caribbean region. And I also want to acknowledge the presence of our Minamata Convention Secretariat colleagues, our Caribbean countries, governments from Rwanda, Nigeria, and all over the globe, no? And of course, our dear Anil Sokdeo and Jewel Batchasing from the Jeff Secretariat. We're really pleased. This is the kind of information exchange and knowledge sharing we have. Noting that we're on the top of the hour, we will not stop the conversation here. We will continue this at the Islands Green Forum, a community of at least 1,200 experts and practitioners around the globe. And we will do a separate session to have Aldo, Britney, and Jiselle join us with Amara and all of our other community experts who interacted today and discuss the questions that have been raised. And with that, colleagues, I think, Maylis, you can again flash our QR code for the people to join the Green Forum. And Karen, our GGKP colleague, is also posting on the chat some links. This is only one way of being with us, so the Green Forum and the webinars. And if we go back one slide, a preview of our Learn Library, as well our Knowledge Hub. All of what Britney, Aldo, and Jiselle talked about will be posted on the Green Forum. And also the knowledge products from the project outputs will be posted on the Learn Library. And so for more information, please contact us. And again, thank you so much, Hadassah, and everybody. Please answer the evaluation survey form after this webinar. Thank you and have a great rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.